So we talked a lot about how plants function in terms of their cells and their molecules. And this topic has to do with plants that have a little bit of extra something on a chemical level. So the topics we'll talk about here, these molecules are sometimes called specialized compounds. And this is the term that I was advised to use by somebody who deals in this field. A little more traditionally, they've been called secondary compounds, with the idea that the primary metabolism is more basic and the secondary metabolism is sort of an add-on metabolism. So we'll talk about basically the chemistry of plants, what they have as options depending on the species for extra molecules they can use to their advantage. So one way to think about this topic, again, sort of plant extras. So if we think about extra, then we should think about the plant minimum. What are the minimum molecules it takes to be a plant? So your general plant has cells, does photosynthesis, interacts with water, and so on. So it has some very basic molecules that we have talked about, as well as the basic cellular metabolism. So DNA, amino acids, and so on, cellular molecules. But think about the minimum. So what does it take if you strip down a plant and you had a plant produced with only what it needs to live in what I'm calling here this pampered environment? So if you wanted to cultivate a plant on a shelf where you provide it with nutrients and water and light and absence of things that try to eat it and so on, that's kind of this primary baseline function of a plant. But of course, plants in their environment interact with a whole lot more, as we will see. So this basic metabolism, as I said here, we've got these kind of two terms that we're going to use a little bit of both. So basic metabolism is kind of this baseline fundamental metabolism. And then sometimes they call that also the primary metabolism. Has to do with some of these very basic molecules. So this is a chart of the interconversion of big categories of molecules. So this is really basic molecules that just about every plant can make, and they have the ability to convert between these different kinds of molecules. So we see glucose on there, actually glucose, pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, those are all involved, you may remember, in cellular respiration. So again, very basic fundamental cellular processes, as well as the molecules on the ends, the starches and the fatty acids. Starches are complex strings of carbohydrates. Fatty acids can be built up from this acetyl-CoA starting point. And so we've got our categories of carbohydrates and lipids. I'm not really going to dwell into it, but the amino acids branch off from here. The nucleic acids branch off from here. And there we go. Nucleic acids, amino acids. So looking at this from a plant perspective, we have to think again, as we often do, about what it takes for plants to survive in their environment. That might be a different challenge to what animals have to undergo in their environment. So plants, one of their basic generalized functions of plants is that they can't get around. So plants are rooted into the soil, and whatever the weather brings, whatever the herbivores bring and so on, a lot of what's depicted in this image. So we have differences in temperature and light and precipitation and pressures from herbivores underground, above ground, competition from neighbors and so on. All of this is something that a plant has to deal with in place. It can't pick up and walk away. So one way to think about that is, well, what does an animal do if it encounters an unwelcome circumstance that it needs to get away from? Well, it's getting away from rain, cold, darkness, predators, things like that. So as opposed to getting away from those, they can't move away from them. So plants often have a chemical strategy for solving these pressures from outside. So plants have quite a few extra chemical abilities. Animals also have a very diverse metabolism that we're not going to talk about in this class, but just from the plant perspective, plants have a lot of branches off of that basic metabolism structure. So I've got now the basic metabolism in this kind of golden color, and then the arrows lead away into some other categories of molecules. So lots of different molecule categories. This isn't a chemistry class, but you might be familiar with some of these. So for example, alkaloids, nicotine, caffeine, you've probably heard of those. They have similar characteristics as well as similar properties. So these are stimulants in mammals like ourselves. And these are chemically active and economically important molecules. Other ones, beta carotene, some of the scents you might be familiar with, and so on and so on. We'll talk about a few of these. Here's THC. This has been in the news a bit. This is the active molecule of cannabis, tetrahydrocannabinol. So as a plant, not every plant can do this. That makes it specialized. But if a plant is going to make this tetrahydrocannabinol, then it starts with this basic fatty acid building block, works its way up through this specialized category and into a particularly specialized category, and so on. So everything biochemically starts from a basic starting point and builds up to a complex endpoint. And that's what we'll kind of find in common with a whole bunch of what we talk about today. So I also want to point out that a lot of these molecules that you've already encountered, a lot of them were named because they were discovered in plants. So plants are a little easier to study. People don't mind so much when you grind up a bunch of asparagus, but they might have some problems if you ground up a bunch of animals. So a lot of times chemists might have made some of their first discoveries in plants. So you see some names of molecules you might know about. Asparagine is an amino acid, and that has a lot in common with the name asparagus, which is a kind of plant. And so that would be the connection. This is a molecule named for the plant where it came from. So sometimes we'll see cases where the name of the molecule is reminiscent of something you might already know from the plant kingdom, or maybe a group of plants that you need to learn about. Just have a couple others on here, arabinose and ribose. These also have names that are built off of a plant name, but it's a little bit more of a stretch. So they're arabinose traces back to this a little more common name, gum arabic, for a plant from Africa. So as I mentioned, plants make these secondary molecules from simple starting points. And you could do these kind of pathways over and over again, and just different examples in different organisms. I find it fascinating. I don't consider myself anywhere an expert on any of this, but yeah, I think it's kind of satisfying to see the starting point and the end point. And we're looking at over here starting common molecule acetyl coenzyme A. Again, this is one of those that was present in cellular respiration. And all these arrows here, these are biochemical conversions. So we won't get into the details of these, but being able to make these changes, a lot of these changes depend on, on specific enzymes that can make that happen. So for a plant to have the enzyme to make that chemical change, has to have a gene for that enzyme, basically has to have a special genetic toolkit to be able to make that change. So lots of arrows separating this simple acetyl coenzyme A molecule from all the way over here. Linalool is one of the common scent chemicals you find in flowers and other parts of plants. To get to that point, lots of specialized conversions, and finally a molecule that has a biologically important function. So as I mentioned, this is a scent chemical. One of its functions is to attract pollinators to flowers. So if you can successfully make that change, you have a molecule that serves as a signal to an animal pollinator. And there's a wide variety of functions that these specialized compounds can have. Again, kind of ties in with what I talked about before, the functions that plants need to do because they can't move. So if you have a seed inside of your plum that needs to get around, and you can entice an animal by having particular color and a flavor and a scent to that, if those all help you to move these seeds around, then those are molecules that are involved in doing something valuable for you as a plant. Some of these are a little more one-step molecules. So attracting an animal to visit your flower, again, part of that chemical signaling, saying to the animal here, I have something to offer you, and the animal can key in to follow the scent. Sometimes scent is a more effective communicator than vision. And everybody wins here. The plant gets what it needs with some pollination, and the animal gets what it needs with some food. Some other examples here, plant defense. These are the stinging hairs of a stinging nettle plant. Here we're back to cannabis and some trichomes here, some glandular hairs on the surface of this plant that are good for defense. Here we got some color changes, some changing leaf colors in the fall, so pigment molecules, and then another plant defending itself. This is a poison ivy leaf that has an active oil that causes an allergic reaction in humans and other animals. So visual attraction, what does it take to be visually attractive? Well, we talked about pigments a little bit. So if you remember, a pigment molecule is a molecule that is absorbing light. And we often talk about the pigments that are absorbing some of the visual lights that are visually something we can observe as humans. So what we call the visible light spectrum is particular to our species, but you'd also have similar molecules potentially absorbing into the ultraviolet range or the infrared range. And they serve this function of standing out against the background for an animal that is visually oriented. So ourselves, we're a species that takes in a lot of information using our eyes. And if you're looking for something to eat, if you're out in the jungle, you would notice something that is brightly colored or sharply contrasted with the background. And that's what this bird is doing here as well. And so being able to make that color, the color is the result of making pigment molecules that absorb some parts of the visual spectrum. So we've definitely talked about chlorophyll. This is the important pigment molecule for doing photosynthesis. So it's the reason plants are green, but it's also serving a much more important function. So being green is kind of a secondary side effect to this more important function of enabling photosynthesis to happen. But certainly this is why the vegetative parts of plants typically are green. Finding the color green in nature is often a signal that you've encountered a plant. But there are related molecules that are differently colored. So again, you're probably going to get sick of these, but I think they're cute and helpful in some ways. So this is a couple of different graphs that together give you the full synthesis of chlorophyll. We're starting again with a simple molecule, glutamate. This is one of the amino acids. So this would be present in the organism, present in all organisms, as far as I know. And so this is getting converted. It gets more complicated. The bottom of this one ends at protoporphyrin 9. This one picks up at protoporphyrin 9, and then finally over here, chlorophyll A. So again, through these series of changes, these arrows indicating steps that have enzymes involved, eventually this simple starting molecule of glutamate becomes this very complicated, essential, unique to photosynthetic organisms, this very important molecule of chlorophyll A. And that gives plants their green color. What about other colors? So we have these other colors called carotenoids. There are a few different kinds of pigments. And again, these are called secondary pigments. So the primary pigments are the ones that are essential for photosynthesis. And the secondary pigments can sometimes take on other functions. So visual attraction is one that we often think about. These are a couple examples in the lycopene found in tomatoes and the carotenoids found in these various fruits on the right here. These are colors that are cueing animals into the presence of a ripe fruit. So they say, ready to eat. And they're not necessarily doing anything for photosynthesis in that moment, but they have a color, and being able to make those molecules allows these plants to advertise the ripeness of their fruit. Down in the lower left, we have some ginkgo leaves. This is showing a pigment called xanthophyll, the yellow pigment in leaves, and potentially involved in photosynthesis. And then this is one that shows through as the green is departing the leaves in the fall. So sometimes in the fall, when leaves change colors, they're losing their green, and we get to see what's left under the green. And sometimes it's this bright yellow color. And then, of course, some of the dietary features that we like about these carotenoids, they're not just colorful, but eating colorful molecules provides us with valuable building blocks for putting together our own molecules, such as molecules important for vision. As we'll see, there's some other functions of these molecules. So making carotenoids is a branch off of the main here at acetyl coenzyme A. That's this IPP, or isopentenyl pyrophosphate step, gets you up to eventually beta carotene. Here's a more detailed version of that, starting at this isopentenyl pyrophosphate, xanthophylls. Another kind of pigment. So the carotenoids are one kind of pigment. This is a whole different kind of pigment molecule known as flavonoids. Big differences are that this kind of molecule is water soluble and the carotenoids are lipid soluble. So they have a little bit different shades of color. This is more in the kind of pinks to blues to, I guess we'll stick with those kind of purples, pinks, and blues. And the carotenoids a little bit more in the reds and oranges, if I were to generalize. Very different kinds of molecules, but of course a lot of the same effects. So being able to put colors into flowers, this is a group of them. Here's a couple more examples of molecules named for the plants that made them. So pelargonidin, the plants that you might often see as geraniums, their genus name is actually Pelargonium. So Pelargonium, pelargonidin. The larkspur is called delphinium, and this is delphinidin, a pigment isolated from that kind of plant. And as I mentioned, these are molecules that are sometimes helpful to us. So as humans, we have a certain kinds of molecules that are known as vitamins, and they're vitamins because we need to get them, our body needs them, and we need to get them from foods that we eat. So vitamins are molecules that we can't synthesize on our own. So your body cannot just come up with carotenoids or riboflavin, I believe so. And so we have to get these from different features of our diet. And you'll see around this wheel of different vitamins, these are the names for the vitamins, A, B1, B2, and so on. Vitamin C over here. And some of these panels are heavy in the plants. So all plants here, all plants here, all plants there. Fish shows up in quite a few of these. Here's a planty B7, plant B9. Vitamin C is a plant feature. So eating plants as part of your diet, this is an important ability to get these molecules that the plants might have been using them for one reason, but when you get them into your body, you can convert them into other molecules that are also essential for your body. So even more, here's some more synthesis. Shikimate was one of those starting points, early branches off of the basic primary metabolism. Here's another one. Told you you'd probably get sick of these. And every once in a while, this was an interesting study. There's a property of light called iridescence that you might have learned about in your physics class. That has to do with the wavelengths of light. So you can actually make something appear to have a color by affecting how much distance there is between layers of reflecting light. And this is sometimes used by plants. So this is a type of plant. You might see this a little more in like insect exoskeletons, sometimes have iridescence like this. And every once in a while, you've got something like this plant where the plant has figured out how to be iridescent on its own. So this is an interesting situation, as it says here, that the fruits of this are not blue per se, but they're reflecting light in a way that makes them appear to be blue. So two ways to get to the same endpoint, I guess.